Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to see such a huge crowd here. This is really fantastic. I'm sorry if you missed out on the plant sale. I heard they were going real fast this morning, but I'm really glad that you stayed around for the lecture. My name is Julia Paratori. I'm an assistant curator here at the Met Cloisters, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Cloisters' very first lecture in honor of Earth Day, Taming Medieval Nature by Greg Bryda, assistant professor of art history at Barnard College, followed by a conversation between Greg and Shirin Fozi, the Paul and Jill Ruddick curator, associate curator here at the Met Cloisters. Thank you so much for joining us today. The program today will find us exploring medieval Europeans' relationships to the lands they inhabited. And in light of this, before we begin that journey, I'd like to take a moment to share that the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Met Cloisters are situated on Lenape-Hoking, homeland of the Lenape diaspora, and historically a gathering and trading place for many diverse native peoples who continue to live and work on this island. We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities, past, present, and future, for their ongoing and fundamental relationships to the region. Thank you. Creating an annual lecture in honor of Earth Day has long been a dream of Cloisters staff. Because our galleries and gardens collectively house both a historical collection of art objects and a living collection of plants, we take very seriously our responsibility to share with our visitors the people of the past's relationships with the natural world. This remit takes on a special urgency today, as reflecting on our historical interactions with the environment can help us to better understand our own place on this planet in a time of global climate change. I envision that today's program will be the first, or I hope at least, will be the first in a long line of annual events celebrating Earth Day, but I invite you to watch this space as we integrate many other kinds of events and programs and gallery features related to both the historical and botanical sides of our collection that explore medieval and modern ecologies. Gregory Bryda is the perfect person to inaugurate our Earth Day lecture series. His 2023 book, The Trees of the Cross, explores the fraught relationship between medieval church and plants in late medieval Germany, examining a tangled history through a truly fascinating array of objects and texts. It's a pleasure to have Greg here because he is also a former Cloisters intern. So what a glorious return to be up here on the stage at Fuente Dueña. Greg is going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then he will be joined by our associate curator, Shirin Fozi, for a conversation and for questions. Shirin's also a former intern, so the underlying message here is apply for an internship. Without further ado, Greg Bryda.
This is totally surreal. I'll start with a bit of a shameless self-promotion about my book that appeared last year and is available on Amazon and Yale Books if you'd like to purchase it. But in a more serious note, it is kind of beyond language that I'm here. I'm sorry, Leslie. I'm on the right. This is in June, it will be a 20-year-old photograph. So it was the summer of 2004 when I started my journey here at the Cloisters. So beyond language to be back. Thank you, Dania, Julia, and Shirin for this opportunity to kick off the Earth Day lecture series. And what a beautiful day to do so. I was hoping that the weather would be like this today because I wanted today to talk about spring. Springtime merrymaking in Germany that revolved around trees has very deep roots. The great 13th century poet Neidhart von Royenthal tells us that as sap rose again after long winters, a village's grandest linden or limewood tree came into bloom and awakened the local people too, stirring them to wild exuberances in song and dance, which Hieronymus Bach had famously memorialized in woodcut in his herbal book from 1539. The central stocky tree with its busy network of foliating branches dominates the upper 2/3 of the picture, providing cover to the musicians and revelers, who, with the help of a jug of booze off to the right, persist partying throughout the day. So overcome they are with the joie de vivre of dancing into May, tanzen in den Mai, as Germans call it still. Instead of celebrating around a rooted limewood, villagers also honored the annual cycle of renewal and rebirth by sacrificing the finest local tree, felling it, dragging it into town, delimbing it to its crown, and decorating it with wreaths, flowers, streamers, and other ornaments on May Day, hence the English term Maypole and the German Maibaum. Brought from the forest into town, the giant vegetal votive was staged and folded into the wide assortment of amusements and games played throughout the spring and summer festivals to reenact the spirit of reaping gifts that people sought back from nature in the form of good harvests. As part of a game pictured here in Albert Glockenden's Nuremberg Breviary from the 1530s, above the round dancers, a peasant man can be seen clambering up the maypole's smooth trunk to attempt to capture the prized rooster surmounting it. Though shorn from the earth, the maypole still thrives, as attested by its bushy crest. Dangling with glass trophies, it contrasts with that of the lone, desiccated and fruitless tree of the owl on the left, a harbinger of death and misfortune. Because the maypole encouraged a heathen-like veneration of nature per se, and intimated a barbaric perversion of the crucifixion, composed as it was of a sacrificed treasured wood, hoisted upright and draped with gifts, the church frowned on, or at least had a fraught relationship with it. Caesarius of Heisterbach, Johannes Geile von Kaisersberg, and other religious figures compared maypoles to the golden calf, idol adorned by the Israelites. They also describe maypoles as an affront to the second commandment, specifically for how they mocked the crucifixion. Maypoles inverted the kind of veneration that should only be properly bestowed upon the ultimate trophy, the body of Christ, hanging from the saintly trunk of the cross, not prizes slung from a maypole. Clerics did not miss this formal and functional congruence. They either shunned maypoles and tree dances altogether, or sometimes they claimed and tamed them for the church, associating them directly and their use with the wood of the cross, and hence the theme of my lecture, how trees and nature, time and again, had to be tamed by the church, and how often nature and how often the church did that through, specifically, the wood of the cross. If one looks closely enough, one can identify a thinly veiled critique of the maypole as a corrupted aberration of the crucifixion in a group of early 16th century prints by the Beham brothers of Nuremberg. Sebald Beham's expansive panorama of the church anniversary holiday features an almost encyclopedic array of revelrous activities that took place at festivals in the German countryside. This is literally the kind of festival culture that predates modern festival culture today. These are the antecedents. On the left side of the composition, ordered and restrained activity is set before the towering cross-crowned steeple. A couple is seen marrying below a devotional image of the Virgin and Child. On the other side, a maypole carrying a rooster counterbalances it on the right. It is here where Beham relishes in the scene's potential for parody, and for clarity's sake, I'm comparing his print with a conventional crowded crucifixion group scene from the period. Staying with Beham's print, a lone man can be seen above the fray as he makes a break to claim the trophy. He indecorously wraps his body around the trunk to shimmy upward, crossing one ankle over the other. A crowded mass of peasants below beholds his achievement. Their lances and pitchforks, intimating those of the Romans and the centurion, whose echo gallops away on horseback above. In the foreground, the arm gestures of the players on the bowling green hearken those wagering for Christ's unhemmed garment, just as those of a woman yanking her husband away from a sword fight do the Magdalene mourning from the foot of the cross. In many such woodcuts of the late medieval spring festivals from Sebald and his younger brother Bartel, the scenes of peasant festivals literally and compositionally radiate about a central delimbed tree. In the case illustrating the so-called nose dance, the upright post is shunted into a small mound of earth, not unlike the way the cross's vertical beam is often depicted by artists. Its short crossbars bearing rewards, like the pole behind it, give it the air of an impotent dummy compared to the one on which Christ was shown crucified. As Protestant artists, the Bayhams parodied the behavior exhibited at Catholic spring festivals, but also the very nature of festival culture more broadly, which honored saints and their relics, like the Holy Cross and the other Arma Christi, or the weapons used to execute him. Their prints also criticized what had been the Catholic absorption of the maypole, and some religious figures, in fact, layering the maypole over the cross as the tree of life. In the late Middle Ages, May devotion, or what Germans call Maiandacht, seized on the liturgical observation of numerous cross-oriented feasts in May, principally the so-called Invention of the Cross on May 3rd, but also the May's movable feasts of the Cross Week and the Feast of the Lance and Nails. Indeed, the Bayham's prints make light of the festive stand-in for the cross, as well as the resemblance between the maypole prizes and the Arma Christi, like St. Peter's rooster, the crown of thorns, and Veronica's veil, all of which adorned a host of columnar Catholic artworks that played on the secular maypole, as you can see here. The Dominican mystic Henry Suso is the first religious figure we know to have actually and actively absorbed the maypole and tamed the folkloric object into Christian ideology, building off the centuries entrenched topos of the cross as the tree of life. One cleric in his wake on the right, the Franciscan preacher Stefan Fridolin, wrote an entire devotional treatise that spiritually reenacted the real-life practice of townspeople on May Day. As a drawing in the treatise shows, for a nun's devotion to the spiritual maypole, a Christ child rewards her with what a festival goer would have also won, a wreath, this one of forget-me-nots, which is a floral play on the Eucharistic utterance. Quote, "This is my body, which is given to you. This do in remembrance of me." Other artworks bear a more explicit footprint of Christ's cross as a maypole or a festive tree adorned with the instruments of his passion as devotional trophies, illustrating a different treatise of the spiritual maypole, the geistlicher Maibaum. This one written in Ulm around the year 1482 by an unknown author. A little-known woodcut shows Christ sandwiched in the fork of a tree from which hang a wide array of the Arma Christi. It's reminiscent of how festive spring trees looked in the early modern period. In it, a melancholic Christ, beaten but not yet crucified, balances the weight of his thoughts on his left arm and leg, which he plants atop a stump. He pensively gazes with St. Peter's rooster alight the same branch that supports the hammer, the slip-knotted rope, and the birches. Remarkably, the cross seems absent. That is, unless the oak tree itself, known for its bifurcated trunk, functions as its stand-in. According to apocryphal legend, particularly popular in Germany, the tree that ultimately yielded the wood used for Christ's cross was born of a sprig from the tree of life that the archangel Michael delivered from paradise to Adam's son Seth. As an illumination from the hours of Catherine of Cleves makes plain, the true wood may resemble ordinary wood, but it is indeed shinier, glistening in a league of its own. Its three prongs bespeak its destiny, ultimately crossing over and taking root in fallen post-lapsarian soil over Adam's grave. The saintly vegetable endures an odyssey through biblical and contemporary time, constituting the only hagiography in the golden legend of saints' lives that revolves around a non-human object. Far from inert and passive, the wood steers its own destiny toward reuniting with Christ at the crucifixion. It assumes anthropomorphic qualities and behaviors, emulating traits of resilience and faith exhibited by its fellow cohort of saintly people. But it is precisely for its idiosyncratic materiality among the saints as divinity in vegetal body that the cross accorded the church a medium through which it could exert control over and tame the cross's lowlier material and formal counterparts in the created world of greenery, in our world of regular herbs, plants, and flowers. Many of the episodes from the popular legend, the popular cross legend, are in fact reenacted in a small, understudied category of carved crucifixes that miraculously arose out of local German trees in the first decade of the 14th century. Two such artworks come from the Westphalian village of Lage, on the left, the other from the town of Cranenburg near Cleves. The example from Cranenburg on the right is more accurately a semi-crucifix, and it is the product of a miraculous marriage between a consecrated host and plant. As the legend goes, around the year 1300, the sexton of the town's church, who had fallen ill, anxiously hid the host between two branches of an oak tree in the local forest, only to return to find it had disappeared and sunk into that very tree. 28 years later, no coincidence there, the Cranenburg Corpus Christi sprang forth miraculously after the tree had been hacked down by unsuspecting foresters. Although it bears no visible trace of the Holy Sacrament, the conceit is that the artwork emerged from the part of the tree that fused with it. The wood and the forms then are imbued with Christ's real presence. The cross armature itself is therefore deliberately missing, but the object's wooden constitution and the shape it takes harkens it, as does the story of the miraculous, ornery, curmudgeonly Cranenburg tree from which the whole work emerged. Since 1414, a landmark stele has honored the site of the original tree, which split in half and yielded the Cranenburg crucifix. This is my husband and our friends in Germany when we went to go see it many years ago. The landmark, and we had a picnic next to it too. I'm not sure if that was sacrilegious. The landmark also served as a waypoint for cross processions. Both the Lage and Cranenburg cross would have participated in a larger constellation of springtime meteorological rituals oriented around the Feast of the Cross on May 3rd. Some of those rituals are still celebrated today. Infused with the mystical qualities of the true cross itself, the crucifixes furnished the cross altars inside their churches, but at pivotal moments in the agricultural and liturgical calendar, they were ritually processed outside its walls to render the surrounding landscape and its vegetation with the potential for new divine intercession, which, in turn, for the people of these towns to this day, would ideally result in more wood in the form of plentiful crops. Just as the histories of the Holy Cross came to punctuate real-life medieval German topographies, the Virgin Mary, for her genealogical connections to Christ and the cross, also became miraculously manifest in nature, and in her case, not only in miracle-working trees, but also waters. A favorite iconography among master glaziers and illuminators, Jesse trees populated cathedral windows and manuscript pages throughout Europe, visualizing the roots of the church in the genealogy of Christ, starting with Jesse of Bethlehem and continuing all the way through Mary. A family of pictures of the so-called Tree of the Virgin, the Arbor Virginis, abbreviates the Tree of Jesse to underscore the blurring together of the Holy Cross's lineage and the genealogical tree of Christ's ancestry in Mary and her parents, Anne and Joachim. A South German woodcut and a painted panel from the wings of an altarpiece from a Cistercian nunnery play on the idea of the Virgin as virga, meaning trunk or rod, concretizing the arboreal metaphors of her immaculate stalk and scion, and ultimately incorporating Mary structurally into the history of the tree of the cross. The filial tree, as you can see, penetrates through her heart and her upright body, ramifying out from her heart and bifurcating into the two branches from which Christ hangs. The genealogical and arboreal themes of the cross legend intersect with aquatic themes and come to life at the altars of two so-called fountain churches located in Germany's Odenwald, which is a tract of forested low mountains in western Germany. Water and wood were mutually reinforcing horticultural themes that here conjure up their typological antecedents in the tree and fountain of life in paradise. Two astonishing altarpieces for both fountain chapels at Schürlenbach and Amorsbrunn signpost the miracle springs in their immediate vicinity. For example, the original hatch at Amorsbrunn opens from the chapel's door, or from the chapel's floor directly to the holy water beneath, whose curative properties have been appreciated since at least the 11th century. Indeed, the altarpiece's contiguity with their physical environs, seemingly sprouting out of the streams coursing below them, is thematized by the unusual but calculated decision to preserve the wholeness of the Jesse trees themselves. Untruncated, the Jesse tree here traverses from Jesse's abdomen in the predella, or the base of the altarpiece, through a hole in the cabinet's floorboard, self-consciously defying the conventional compartmentalizations of a typical German winged edible. This is pretty unprecedented. In Amorsbrunn, according to conservator reports, the tree is hardly worked with a knife. Flat across one plane, but divaricating out and upwards to illustrate the schematic ancestry of Christ and his mother, the tree maintains its physical integrity as a singular body of wood, rather than carving and joining multiple pieces. The Jesse tree itself must have been espaliered or tamed into appropriate shapes ahead of time while it was still alive, or at least was constructed to give this impression. This is a picture of the espaliered tree downstairs. Taken out of the world, the Jesse trees are reworked, silvered, and they're adorned with gilded flourishes to become extraordinary trees on an altar. Independent from water and typologies associated with the fountain of life, there are countless examples in medieval Germany of miraculous wooden Marian images produced out of or in proximity to trees. Two of many tree-centered Marian cults in late medieval Germany stand out for their documentation in the historical record, and because the wood sculptures around which their legends are oriented still exist. The town of Hessenthal takes its name from the hazelnut bush forming the heart of a legend around a miraculous statue of Mary. Skeptical of miracles, as the legend goes, a knight stabbed the bush, which then bled and yielded the carving of Mary holding the deposed Christ. A miraculous Marian statue also attracted pilgrims to the Franconian town of Schneeberg, where in 1470 they were granted indulgences for paying homage to the so-called Mother of God on the mulberry. Drawing the ire of Martin Luther in 1525, a very famous miracle-working Marian statue of wood that hung on the same oak tree where a cart driver had a vision of her in the Saxon village of Eiche, inspired massive processions as early as 1463 on the feast day of John the Baptist, midsummer, in mid-June, quote, to avert a bad harvest that was expected due to drought. Such tree-centered miraculous carvings call to mind the branch tracery stained glass windows from Constance, now on view here in the Marode Gallery. Many thanks to Shirin and the caretakers for bringing that back up into view so people can look at them. Representing the flesh-colored man of sorrows on the left, donned in ruby red, exhibiting his wounds, and across from him, the pallid mourning Mary rendered entirely in grisaille, a painterly mode often deployed to convey sculpture. This is sculpture. Standing on pedestals, obscured by stumps, jutting up to their knees, the figures are also enjungled in floral patterns of black enamel paint, tempting me not only to cross-reference them with familiar, formal, and morphological counterparts from the superstructures of giant carved altarpieces like this one from Tillman Riemenschneider, but also to consider them in the context of more amateurish, miraculous carvings on a different class, like those I've just discussed, which uncover a shared discourse between the bodies of Christ, Mary, the trees of the cross, and the life world of greenery. The artworks of maypoles, crucifixes, and family trees discussed in this presentation draw together biblical time and the present, allowing the former to be reborn in the latter. That this happens seasonally allows drawing on that sacred potential when it was most needed, at the time of fertility and of the risk that that fertility would be cut off by bad weather. What the artworks all express is more than just symbolic, and rather a mode of image making that reveals a densely layered religious meaning in the lived environment through a single material, wood. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's so wonderful to see you. It's great to see a packed auditorium on this beautiful Earth Day. And it's my great joy and delight to get to ask the first several questions of Greg. But we're going to try to remember to not get too carried away so that there's time for audience questions
so
as well.
someone can wave at us when we've hit our time.
And so this is my first time being up here while there's a screen. And Greg, I don't know if you've noticed, but the whole time you were talking, our beautiful Spanish crucifix has been casting this cross shadow over the screen. So I think that's a great place to start, is to try to bring this into the conversation. And I love that, of course, you ended with our great stained glass panels, connecting it with the collection here at the Cloisters. So I think one thing to ask you, our collection goes from, it starts around 1100, give or take, here at the Met Cloisters. Downtown, we have earlier medieval artwork as well. Goes up until the 1500s and the materials that you were talking about, right? So your lecture was mostly focused on kind of the end of the time period that we cover here. But I was going to ask you to connect it back to earlier examples like this one hanging so dramatically above us. It's great seeing him at this angle. He's from about 300 years earlier than these materials. He's from Spain, but he's also a huge wooden crucifix. So one thing I wanted to ask, so I've got two questions at once. One is whether this kind of attention to wood and the materiality of wood and the kind of connections of wood as the tree of life, whether you also see it in the earlier period or whether you see it as something very different. Yeah. But also with your Cranenberg example, this just occurred to me sitting in the audience, that this idea of a Eucharist inserted into wood, and then the wood miraculously, a miracle happens when the Eucharist is connected to the wood. Right. The art historians in the room will know that around 980, there was a miracle like this in Cologne connected to what's now known as the Garrow cross, which I won't get into all the details. But the thing is that this miraculous crucifix that has an origin story of a Eucharist being inserted into the wood back around 980, that story was very famous in the city of Cologne, on the banks of the Rhine, in the late Middle Ages as well. So with the Cranenberg example, so first I want to ask, do you see continuities, but also in a very specific way, do you think the Cranenberg example is also self-consciously looking back at this history, or is it more spontaneous? Do you think they were thinking this way?
You're so spot on to bring the Garrow crucifix up. Can I ask the AV to actually, perfect. Oh my God, wow, how did you even, that's crazy. So this is not the Garrow crucifix. It's a different crucifix, but also from Cologne.
Yes.
So, it's important to kind of address the elephant in the room here. We're all like below this
beautiful elephant.
Totally. And I'll promise I'll kind of connect it back to the Spanish example, but by way of this work. So the Cranenberg cross is like amateurish, naughty work, rudimentary looking work that I showed next to the Lager crucifix, which had a green cross shape to it because it was supposed to resemble the tree of life in a more overt way. Those two objects are really emanating from a kind of prototype in Cologne that predates them by a few years, and that's this famous, it's not the Garrow crucifix, it's a different one that's famous in Cologne from a different church called Santa Maria im Capitol. It's carved before the year 1304, and it's famous mostly for one reason. because of the brutality in which Christ is depicted here, which is emblematic of this kind of Rhineland mysticism in the later Middle Ages. But what has gone unnoticed for so long was one patch right by his foot, the nail in his foot, that conservators had discovered that the brown overpainting on this tree, the tree of life that he's crucified to, was originally bright green. And the knobs on the branches were actually gilded. And even the cross itself had blood as painted on it as if the tree itself were bleeding too. And that modern overpainting was a kind of erroneous preservation decision, because in the modern period, people thought that these were plague crosses. They called them Pestkreuze. I mean, Shirin knows this. But for the general audience, this dreary, histrionic, violent depiction of Christ had to have been associated in the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, with the plague. And so the idea that this like bright, green, shiny, glistening cross it was anathema to modern people. That didn't seem to fit. But in fact, it does. I mean, the violence perpetrated against Christ, these mystics, has this uplifting character to it that's really picked up and carried by the tree of the cross. And that is that the treeness of the cross in the late medieval devotion is what Cranenburg crucifix is picking up on, and the Lager crucifix, because even though it's shaped in a different way, it's still green and it has that golden nubs. Now, I mean, this is a very different context than a century before it in Spain. I mean, this is carved in the late 12th century?
Yeah, probably close to 1200, yeah.
Yeah, close to 1200. I mean, so it's a century, I mean, what a difference a century makes, really. But this example that's out of Cologne radiates around Europe and in Southern Europe and also on the Iberian later. The cross as the tree of life in the earlier Middle Ages is usually depicted in a kind of typological way, as a trope or a symbol. But in the later Middle Ages, you start seeing that idea of a trope crystallizing and becoming kind of literal. But the crosses that I showed, well, you mentioned a Eucharistic cross, the Gero crucifix. I'll jump to this one. It's a totally strange object. It's actually in Vienna and emerged in Hamburg in the late 15th century. There are a lot of crosses that actually do build on this trope that Shirin mentioned, of which I guess is the originary example, is in Cologne Cathedral, where the Gero crucifix, it falls down, I think the head cracks, and then they fill it with a host, and then the next day it miraculously is healed, and so then the sculpture itself is infused and imbued with the real presence of Christ. But what we see in the later Middle Ages is definitely more complicated. There's so many more factors happening. These crosses where they're in the later medieval examples where they're infused with the real presence of the Eucharist, they're participating in a very common concept of host desecration narratives, where usually the people who are destroying the hosts are Jews. In this case, this is a cabbage root mandrake crucifix that's in Vienna. It was from Eppendorf in Hamburg, and it's the result of the same context as Cranenburg. It was a woman whose garden abutted a convent whose cabbage garden was really productive and flourishing, and she was jealous, and she took the consecrated host from service and put it under a root, and then overnight it was glowing like the way a mandrake usually would, according to legend, and then the real body of Christ was miraculously hewn without human hands in its root, and she was executed for desecrating the host that way. But this was later put into a monstrance, and so while it participates in Gero, there's a lot of other kind of political explanations for this too. This is Achim Timmermans, an art historian at the University of Michigan, who's doing a lot of work on way crosses and some crucifixes like these, crucifixes that are in the middle of the environment, in the middle between towns on pathways that people would have prayed to, tucked away in the environment because there was a lot of anxiety in the 15th century about good harvest. This was the Little Ice Age. So you could even think of these objects emerging in a kind of environmentally deterministic way. So I know you had other questions embedded in that first one too. I hope I addressed.
No, you addressed so much and more. There's a lot to think about here. I think, well, you ended with this point about anxiety.
Sure.
And I wanted to connect that, in thinking about sustainability and thinking about our own modern anxieties about wood and about climate, about the environment around us. But also with this slide reminds me to think very much about wood in a very tangible material way. So one of the things I've been thinking about with your work is that all of this is happening, this kind of intensification of how they're thinking about wood, what kinds of wood, sources of wood. It's also happening at a time when cities are growing, right? Cities are growing rapidly. And so I wanted to ask you about the literal wood and the sources of wood. Is there a backdrop of deforestation? Is that something people are thinking about in the 15th and 16th centuries as well?
Absolutely. I came prepared.
You're so prepared.
With slides about this. I can move this back. So 2 calendar pages from books of hours. They're always the greatest kind of a source for ethnographic vignettes about what European life looked like in the 1400s. So yeah, there was a lot of anxiety around what to do and how to manage forests. So the most typical way that you would manage a forest or prevent deforestation, the typical woodland management was coppicing. So on the left, we actually have a picture of that behind this. This is the death of a boar, but you can see this is an entire coppice field. So coppicing, for those who aren't aware of what it is, you basically chop down a tree and then you try to keep the stump alive and it sprouts out a bunch of smaller trunks and and then as they grow, you can cut them down and harvest them for wood. And you have various patches of different kind of cycles of coppicing. So this patch has been coppicing for 3 years. It's time to cut that down and then rotate to a different patch. The other on the right-hand side is pollarding. So you can see all these tiny sprouts, thinner trunks coming from these larger trunks that are called stools. And then here are pollarded trees, which is kind of the same thing as a coppice, except you don't start from the stool at the ground, you start higher in a tree trunk. And that's nice because you can walk under these trees. They're also safe from animals. And the wood that this produced mostly, we're talking about art and the production of art from trees, but an everyday use, the primary consumption of wood was for fuel, for energy. And so that's why you see these pollarded trees in these, this isn't necessarily a farm, and this is how people grew a lot of their own firewood in manors. So the sourcing of wood for wood carving, though, is a bit of a different story. You would never have, there's various different kinds of trees that you can carve from, and every different kind of tree provides you different qualities. So, there's boxwood, which is super dense, and there's beautiful, famously, late medieval boxwood beads, like prayer beads, prayer nuts, they're called in Dutch, along a rosary that you can open, and they're super duper dense, and you can carve small and intricate forms in them. But the most common, more or less, and this is being very reductive, in the later medieval period and in earlier too, is limewood trees. On the left, we're seeing a limewood carving here at the Cloisters in the late medieval gallery. You can see it. And then on the right, oak. And so oak this is an altarpiece from the Brabant. So like Brussels region, Antwerp. In the Low Countries, altarpieces, which is basically the main the main concentration of wood carving in this period in the 15th century is for altarpieces. You're moving from the High Middle Ages, where the master carvers are attached to cathedrals and they're attached to stone lodges. That taste changes in the later Middle Ages, and it's the altar and decorating the altar that becomes the concentration for artists. So the altarpieces you see in Germany, in southern Germany on the left, are the trees that are actually local there, and they're limewood trees. And limewood was so coveted by carvers and patrons, well, the carvers really, because of how regular and uniform the wood grain is. And that's great. As a wood carver, you do not want like disturbed and kind of abrupt changes in a wood grain. That throws you off. And that's actually the kind when local woods that are from managed forests yield that. like irregular growth rings and things like that. So if you are a limewood carver and you're sourcing your lime, it's coming from local forests, and those forests are smaller than oak forests. The supply is much smaller than oak, so they're highly regulated. You have to apply for a special dispensation for a limewood tree. Weitstoss does this. There's records that exist actually from Nuremberg. He needed 2 trees for a crucifixion group in the Marian Church, which are now in St. Sebald. But the town council had to apply for the foresters to give him this special dispensation. The oak, though, you would think, okay, well then there's plenty of oak trees in Northern Europe. Clearly a lot of these Brabantine or Netherlandish altarpieces must be sourcing their oak from local trees in Northern Europe. They're not, because those lands had been settled for, centuries and centuries. So, and coppiced and pollarded since antiquity. That wasn't a medieval form of forest management at all. For good oak, for oak that had like undisturbed growth rings and very uniform and could be carved easily, they had to go to the Baltic in Eastern Europe. So those were all German commercial colonies. The Hanseatic League is, through the Hansa, basically, they're felling oak trees and also limewood trees in southern Poland. They would fell them and then actually just toss them into the Vistula or into rivers, and they would float down the river to Gdansk or Riga, and then they'd be shipped to Antwerp, to Amsterdam. And so they've done a lot of testing on the trees of these giant, very different style altarpieces, and we can talk about that in a moment. And the sourcing was not, like 90% of the time, was not local. It had to be from wild trees, forests that were still virgin, and those were colonized forests in Eastern Europe that weren't yet kind of pillaged enough to be managed.
This is really fascinating. Thank you. I'm conscious of time, and I want to make sure that there's time for audience questions. So I'm signaling that maybe I'll ask one quick question. Denia, is that good, Denia? Okay. Maybe a quick question to give people, but this is your warning that you will have the opportunity to ask. So think now what questions you'd like to ask. But I'm going to ask such an enormous question that any answer will just have to be very short, because I think we'd need like 5 more hours to get into this. Can you say
a podcast for the future? A
podcast for the future. Can you say just 1 or 2 quick words about paint? Because we've talked so much. We've talked so much about wood and the qualities of wood. So we're thinking now about medieval audiences encountering these things. So many of them being painted, but also in this moment, sometimes not painted. And I know this is a huge scholarly question, but maybe Greg could just fill us in briefly, and then we'll turn it over to the audience.
Yeah, this is a very good question. So I'm giving you a side-by-side comparison here of what altarpieces, these giant carved limewood altarpieces, often look like on the left when it's open. When they're closed, it's just flat painting, minimal gilding, minimal bling. And then when you open it up, that's where the gold is, and that's where the 3-dimensionality is. This is we're dancing between the early modern and the late medieval here, but in this period, it's only there's a lot more potency and the power invested in 3-dimensional artworks, that they could convey real presence better than what we now view as like an illusionistic painting, flat painting that looks like an image receding into a window. But I promise I'll get to your question, Shirin. So this is a painted one on the left. This is normative what they looked like most of the time. On the right is carving a giant altarpiece that was carved maybe about 5 or 6 years after the one on the left. The one's from Blaubeuren, which is in Swabia, both southern German. The one on the right is Franconia. This one is unpainted. Both are made of limewood, though the figures are carved in limewood, and the cupboards are of oak. And in these cases, the oak also probably came from the Baltic, which is very, very fascinating to think about. So this is a huge question in the scholarship. Why, after all these decades, is there this sudden new appearance in taste for a renunciation of paint? And this is the ground zero example, really, the kind of, there are a couple of other altarpieces before, the so-called Holy Blood altarpiece here of unpainted wood. Why a sculptor or a patron would maybe choose not to have an object painted. And it's a complex question to answer, but I'll give you a few bullet points. Painting was expensive. The supply for paint was very expensive, and so was the gilding, and so was the labor. So in fact, actually, this altarpiece on the right cost probably about half as much as it would have otherwise. And when an altarpiece is interesting, when you look at it, you're looking not at just the work of a carver, it's like 4 different masters meeting at the same time, or 3 on the right. You have the furniture maker, the box maker, the cabinet maker. They actually build the cabinet, some of the ornamental decoration. Only the artist could do the figural carving. There's also the locksmith, the Schlosser, the person who's actually doing the hinges, the metalwork hinges, and the lock too, because some of these altarpieces contained relics within them, so they actually had to be quite secure when they were shut. And then the 4th was the Fasmaler, the sculpture painter. And they were paid quite a bit, and also not just for their labor, but also for the raw materials. So there's a lot of speculation. I can return to this question too in the Q&A. One explanation is to save money. I don't think that's a convincing enough explanation. Has anyone seen the altarpiece on the right in person? You can raise your hand if you've seen it in person. Really? Oh, yeah, okay. Well, it's a huge pilgrimage destination for art historians, and in southern Germany, it is not, I mean, there's Michael Baxendahl and a lot of other art historians who've worked on this period have said the other reason for renouncing color is to anticipate the impending hammer of the iconoclasts for the Protestant Reformation, which is down the line, or around the corner, which is to say, this, by renouncing paint, this is placating a kind of image-phobic zeitgeist of the reformers 20 years down the line. But it doesn't really, that doesn't have much purchase with me either. I mean, the reason I ask if you've seen this altarpiece is that when you go to Rothenburg and you ascend the stairs and you're in the western chapel of this church and you see it, it leaves an impression. I mean, the fact that there isn't painting doesn't take any of its, remove or reduce or dial back any of its potency. In fact, actually, the woodiness of it, the fact that it has so much wine and agricultural references, it's super thin. I mean, the entire altarpiece is like this thin. Really, it looks like a terraced object itself on the altar. And that woodiness, the vegetal nature of it, it just looks so raw and like domesticated and homespun when you see it in person. That feel is meant to underscore the fact that the relic, the holy blood that it houses, is a wine relic. It's a sacramental wine relic. So this is really all about wine. In any case, there might be a very specific reason that this particular example, the patrons did not want to paint it. But it's like the history of style. It's kind of, you could think of it in a weird Darwinian way. There's sometimes mutations in historical developments, and then it picks up and it becomes a new taste or aesthetic that morphs into something in its own right, and that's totally divorced from the reason, from the original one here in Rothenburg.
That's fascinating, thank you. So I'm just looking up to see, I should relinquish my microphone.
We have a microphone.
Are you okay, Danya?
Yes. Is it up? Yeah?
I cannot hear you. Are you speaking into a microphone, Denise?
I am.
Okay. Oh, there you are.
Okay, great. So it is on. Okay. All right, I'm Denya, and I have the microphone. If you have a question in mind, please raise your hand. I will bring it to you.
And I am somewhat blinded by the spotlight, Danya. So if you want to pick whose question to answer,
Yeah, I think you'll have
please,
to
I think go for it,
because
because I can't see very
a
well.
vision in front of it.
Sure, I have a good view of the audience.
Who wants to be the brave first? Leslie in the front, I do see.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. And not so much a question, but I just wanted to, well, maybe I'll think of a question after, but I wanted to make a point when you were talking about the pollarding. People can go see pollarded trees in the cloister.
That's right. Yeah.
And the leaves are just now starting to come in, so you can really see the knobbiness of them. So definitely go do that after the talk. And that's just to pick up on the last thing you were talking about with the polychromy. I was also thinking about the fact that it doesn't have, well, that's a question. Is it more lifelike or less lifelike? And yeah.
That's a good, I mean, lifelike is hard to say, right? I mean, like I said, three-dimensional sculpture was considered to have more of like a real presence to people in the pre-modern or early modern period. I'm not sure if the object, I mean, the Riemenschneider altarpiece being unpainted makes it seem more realistic. But another reason, in terms of on the topic of naturalism, another reason that I forgot to mention that scholars have said the patrons may have chosen to renounce color on the right is that when you add paint, what you're doing is actually adding also layers of plaster. So you're actually painting over some of the immaculate carving work, which Riemenschneider is so known for. And so, in fact, on your way out, if you go to the Late Gothic Gallery, there are 2 Riemenschneiders in the collection of the cloisters that are lacking. Art historians are using this term polychromy a lot, for those who aren't aware. That's the fancy word for paint, multicolor. And so they're lacking polychromy. And you can really, because they are, you do get a sense of all those fine lines, especially around, there's a seated bishop who's an elderly man, very typical elderly Riemenschneider face. And some of those lines might have been lost if you painted over them. But still, that in and of itself, I'm not sure can explain why the entire altarpiece here on the right lacks color.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
Bringing it back to Earth Day just for a second, how did the evolution of the different colors that they were able to create from either different plants or different minerals, how did that change through time and kind of dictate what painting was done and how it was painted?
That's a very good question. I mean, a conservator would probably be better equipped to answer that, but I mean, this is not, in the early modern period, the 15th century that I'm talking about, in this like final like swan song of the Middle Ages before the Protestant Reformation, it really isn't that much of a difference in the plants that are used or plants or the minerals that are sourced for pigmentation. But I mean, of course, obviously, the medium with which that they are applied onto surfaces does, famously with oil. So prior to this, one of the medium that was most commonly used to carry or actually put the mineral powder or the substances from herbs onto a surface was tempera. I mean, there's all sorts of, there's also wax or an encaustic, et cetera. Tempera is usually with eggs, but oil was with linseed oil. And again, to reference the collection here, we have in this very building, the same gallery where those 2 stained glass windows are, is the Miro triptych. And that's one of truly the very earliest examples of oil on panel, where those pigments are carried onto the wooden panel with oil, which that affords a completely different effect that I could spend another hour describing. You can render texture in a completely new, a realistic way. It looks as if, I mean, really, and I promise I'll try to keep this short, the way that you paint with oil is so different than you do with tempera. I mean, it doesn't dry. It hardens, it oxidizes. So when you're painting layer over layer of oil, what you're really doing is painting like with glass. I mean, it's like with what oil affords you is not only a kind of a better saturation of color, but different translucencies. And so you can really like bury the redness, the blood of flesh below the actual beige color of skin. And so that you I mean, it's sculpture. It's really different layers of glass, and then you can actually apply the oil while it's wet on wet or wet over dry. That gives all these different kinds of effects of the light reflected through all of those different layers of oxidized oil. And so you should go and look at the actual oil, at the mirrored altarpiece, because it looks so different in real life when you're seeing really that light actually reflect through those various layers rather than how it's flattened on a computer screen or through a photograph. So go look at that work too.
All right, I think our time has come to an end.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Greg.